Well, you asked for it. There's been a lot of demand for a 993 video. It's a model I'm very passionate about, very knowledgeable about. So I'm going to warn you, this is kind of a deep dive. If you don't want to geek out on all the small details on the 993, this may not be for you.
This video is brought to you by American Collectors Insurance. Protect your passion.
Be sure to log into your YouTube account, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a video.
We're going to blather on and on about all sorts of topics. You know, the history of the 993, the changes by year, the various colors, the various configurations, sort of a deep dive on the top side, in the trunk, in the engine compartment, in the interior, the chassis. We're going to go really deep into it. So if you're a 993 enthusiast like I am, you're going to enjoy this one. What's the most logical place to start with the 993? Let's talk a little bit of history with Porsche and what was happening. So we know Porsche was producing the 964, which has now become quite a beloved car. For example, here is a 1992 964 3.3 liter turbo. You can see what the styling was. On this car was 85% new versus the outgoing 3.2 liter Carrera. The 993, however, was just 15% different than the previous 964. So production on the 993 started on August 11th of 1993, and the Cabriolet production started in January of 1994. This car here is a later build 1995 model year. A little bit later in the video, we'll dive into some of the differences by 1995 model year, but I want to use this car to highlight a lot of the changes. The majority of the changes that you see in a 993 are going to be aesthetic. So if we start at the front of the car, they actually raised the front lid 40 millimeters. So a lot of people think that they dropped the fenders. They did drop the fenders, but more than anything, they raised the front of the car 40 millimeters here, which sort of softens the fender, and they laid the headlight back to be more akin to the design language of the 968 and 928, as well as to tie in with the upcoming 986 Boxster. So it's the only air-cooled 911 to feature a very unique front fender design. Of course, that necessitated obviously new front and rear bumper covers. Lots of other changes, little stuff like they updated the whole wipers on these cars. Actually, the coolest engineering change is these wipers cover 80% of the windshield, gets 2 wipes with just 1 pass. Kind of a cool system, really tells the difference. They went to actually the glass on the car, if you will, is adhesived in as opposed to just gasketed in like the previous cars. So the windshield actually sits flusher. What I really like about that, they reduced the wind noise in the cabin. So they actually even brought the rear windows out 7 millimeters. Of course, the doors essentially stay the same, but got a different door handle, and then redesigned the rear quarters on the car, as well as a slight redesign to the rear deck lid, of course, and the rear lighting structure changed. So aesthetically, the 993 really is the most unique of the air-cooled 911s. And when this car came out, it was universally praised, which is very different than the 964 as an example. The faithful really liked the impact bumper car, and when the 964 came out, there was a lot of discussion that they didn't care for the bumper design. I, of course, think they were wrong. I love the 964. But I will say when the 993 debuted, universally, both the motoring press, the general public, and car enthusiasts praised this car. So just a gorgeous design. To give you some idea, they spent about $300 million on this update, if you will. So by today's modern car, that's not a lot of money. They did this thing kind of on the cheap because we know Porsche was in kind of a tough financial strait, and they needed this car to be successful because they were waiting on the upcoming 986 Boxster, which really kind of propelled them successfully forward. So this car came to the US starting in January of 1994, or January 94 production. First deliveries early part of March. In Europe, they got them just a touch earlier. Again, their production started in August of 93 and had deliveries as early as late September of 93. So where it gets confusing, however, is in Europe, those were sold as 1994 model years. Here in the US, we sold all of them, anything from January of 94 until December of 95, as 1995 model year cars. Sort of a crazy difference. But again, just a car that's been beloved by the Porsche faithful since day one, and I'm really excited to take a deep dive into all the technical details. Lest you think Porsche is simply a design company, I want to highlight some of the mechanical changes that switched over from the 964 to 993, because obviously the aesthetic changes are very obvious. The mechanical changes are a little bit more subtle, but really kind of define what this car is about, if you will. So let's start with the engine. The basic engine architecture is shared, 3.6 liters. The engine case is the same, but they made probably a couple dozen major engineering changes within the engine itself. Things like the crank is actually slightly heavier, but they got rid of the vibration dampener. The connecting rods are slightly lighter. The valves are slightly bigger. The biggest change that most people will notice is that it has a completely redesigned exhaust system, a much more efficient exhaust system, as well as a hot film MAF sensor. So those changes, the car went from 247 horsepower in the outgoing 964 to 270 horsepower in the 1994 and 1995 model year 993. So the other big thing from a maintenance standpoint, they got hydraulic lifters, so you're no longer doing valve adjustments as you have been doing since the beginning of Porsche time, starting with the 356. Valve adjusting has been kind of one of our things, no longer the case with the 993. That's a big change. The gearbox, it's still a G50, but it went from a 5-speed to a 6-speed gearbox. They went to a double cone synchronizer in first and second gear, which reduced shift effort about 30%. If I have any qualm about a 964, and my heart bleeds 964, shift effort's a little bit high in that 1-2 plane. Noticeably easier shift quality on a 993 due to that, as well as they made some internal improvements to make it a little bit of a quieter gearbox. They did change, of course, the gear ratios with a 6-speed. We're going to delve into that. Maybe in a little bit of the drawback of the 993. We're going to talk about what that change was. The biggest mechanical change in terms of how the car feels, however, when you drive this car, is it has a completely redesigned rear suspension. It uses an aluminum alloy space frame or where it mounts a multi-link rear suspension. That rear suspension radically changes the dynamic of how an air-cooled 911 feels, particularly at the limit. It no longer has kind of that snap oversteer, which I frankly kind of like. Legends have been made about that, but a 993 is a very, very forgiving car. And real world, the other thing you'll notice is when you drive this car, because that rear frame is mounted on 4 sort of rubber bushings, if you will, it's much quieter. You hear much less suspension noise and crash coming through the rear of the cabin. So for a car you're going to drive and live with, the 993 makes a pretty good choice. So those are some of the mechanical highlights. Let's talk more. Before we go too deep into the video, I want to make a couple disclaimers just so you don't think I've forgotten or you don't get the wrong impression. So a couple things. I'm based here in the US, so we'll be predominantly talking about US domestic market Porsche 993s. However, we do have a German delivery car here. So the information should apply across all markets, but some of this information might be specific to the US. So for my viewers who are outside the US, do be aware there are subtle differences by market. So that's an important distinction to make. The other topic we will not be covering is we will not be talking about values of these cars. And I do that because I don't, one, I get bored of talking about values, but 2, it's going to date this content because the values of these cars are going to change over time, and I'd like this content to stay current. I will speak about some general concepts in terms of how value is derived on these cars, but we won't talk specific numbers. The other thing I want you to know is that as much as I love the 993, I am not a 993 fanboy. So I'm going to give you a very real, truthful, and unvarnished view of the 993, what's good about it, what I don't like about it, because what I tell people is, yes, the 993 is a great 911 amongst many great 911s. There is no bad 911 ever made. I truly, truly believe that. I own them all. They all have their place. So let's dive into the 993. We know the 993 came in a whole litany of variants. So a couple things I want to talk about for this video. First and foremost, because this is an enormous topic, we're not going to cover a few models. They're going to be given their own video potentially. So this video will not be covering turbos. However, much of this information will apply to turbos, but we will not be talking about the 993 Turbo, also a great car. We will not be talking about any of the special variants, 993 RS, any of the cup cars, things like that. Those are going to get their own video. This is predominantly the street-driven, normally aspirated cars, those 7 variants. Those 7 variants, of course, are the regular 993 Carrera Coupe, the 993 Carrera 4 Coupe, which was introduced mid-year for model year 1995 here in the US, okay, as well as the 993 Cabriolet and the Cabriolet 4, Carrera Cab, right? We'll talk about those. Those are 4 variants. Then, of course, we have the 993 Targa, which was introduced for 1996, which is a real change, and it was a bummer not to have one here because it's a very unique car. The previous Targa, of course, would look much like this G model Targa we have in the background with the traditional Targa bar. That went away with the 964, was the last variant like that. Whereas the 993 Targa featured kind of almost like a double sunroof where the entire roof structure was glass and that slid as a double pane underneath the rear window. So we'll talk about that car. And then of course we're going to talk about the wide body cars, which were the 2S, you see here in the Vesuvio edition, as well as the 4S in Zenith Blue behind us as well. So let's jump into the various ones. And with that, let's talk about which one is the best. Everyone always asks, which one is the best? Here is my answer. There's an official answer to this. The best one is, ready for it? The one that speaks to you, the one that you love. Not the one that I love, or not the one the person on a social media platform loves, or the one they think is the coolest. Which one pulls your heartstrings? So I can tell you, this particular yellow car behind us is my personal 993. So my passion, I love 1995 model year Carrera late build coupes with manuals. That's my choice for a 993. However, if you want a Targa, you want a Cabriolet, you want a 4, you want a 4S, I celebrate that. Drive the one, own the one that you love. There's a lot of debate about that. Let's talk a little bit about broad concepts around value by variant, because this is kind of important. So essentially, of those 7 variants, if you think about them from a value standpoint, your most valuable configuration currently in the market, and I don't see this changing, would be the 2S manual transmission coupe, right? There's always a lot of argument between the 2S and the 4S people, which one should be more valuable. I can just speak in the market. The 2S's are about 60% the production of worldwide production of the C4S, and as a result, they hold a slight premium. Not much of one, but a very slight premium over a 4S. Next down the food chain behind the wide body cars is generally the regular Carrera Coupe, followed by the Carrera 4 Coupe, okay? Then the Targa, pretty close to normally narrow body 993 valuation for like quality and miles. And then the next step would generally be the Carrera Cabriolet, the Carrera 4 Cabriolet, and then anything with a Tiptronic would sell at a discount in relation to its variant in the market. So for example, a 2S Tiptronic will still likely be worth more than a similar narrow body manual, but it'll sell at a significant discount to the 6-speed version. We're going to delve into the Tiptronic in the deep dive portion of the video, but I will say, just like I said about the variant, this is not any derogatory about a Tiptronic. Buy the car that works for your lifestyle and how you want to use the car. The Tiptronic is a very reliable and good transmission. That just sort of speaks to the value. So your best value in the market, if you're open to it, is a Cabriolet, but again, buy the car that speaks to you. Well, let's just jump right into the #1 most controversial topic in 993 land, and what is that? Narrow body versus wide body. Which one? Which one's better? What are the differences? Again, buy the one that speaks to you. I can definitively tell you from a value standpoint in the marketplace, a wide body will always outperform a narrow body car. However, everyone has their preference. Again, for me personally, I'm a narrow body person. And let me explain what some of the differences are. We've got 2 wide body cars here and 3 narrow body cars, so we can walk through the differences. So first off, we're starting at the front. You're going to notice one of the big changes is they have a different bumper cover design. I do find the bumper cover design on the wide body car is a more attractive front bumper cover. This is a European edition, so it does not have the bumperettes that we got here in the US. I just find the design is a little more pleasing. I don't like how the bumper covers split on the narrow body car, even though I do love narrow bodies. I do find the bumper cover design to be slightly better. Okay, let's move back to the front fenders. There's a misconception that when people say it's a wide body, they think the 993 wide body is wider in the front, and the answer is it is not. They use the exact same fender. This actually is one of the reasons I prefer the narrow body car. I find the design to be a little bit more cohesive front to back. However, same fender in the front. As we walk down the sides of the car, the rocker changes. So on a 993 narrow body, you can see the rocker kind of rolls in, whereas on the wide body car, the rocker flares out. And that's really to accommodate the rear flares. Anyone know what the width difference is? It's 30 millimeters aside. So you have a 30 millimeter wider rear fender. For us in the US, that's just over an inch. So not a huge difference, but it does make a difference. A lot of people wonder did they get a different suspension? Because of course it's wider and they have a wider track, and the answer is simply no. Porsche just changed the offset on the wheels from an ET65 on the narrow body car to an ET40. So I've always actually thought it was weird. They brought the fender out 30 millimeters, but they only brought the wheels out 25 millimeters. Kind of an interesting factoid for you there. Let's move around to the back of the car. This is where most people get real excitable about the wide body car. I mean, it does just have a beautiful set of rear hips, particularly when you view it just down low and you kind of see the light coming off that fender. It is a gorgeous look. I do have to agree. Again, for me, what I like about the narrow body car is I like the fact that it's a little more balanced front to rear. It's less weighty in the back, but we're probably splitting hairs just a little bit. A lot of people think, well, it's either a 2S or a 4S, so it likely gets a bigger motor, like a modern Porsche. You buy a modern 992 Carrera S, it of course has a bigger motor than a regular Carrera. In the 993 era, sadly, that is not true. They actually have exactly the same mechanicals. So if anything, they're actually slightly slower because they have slightly higher drag and they weigh a little bit more. So sort of just an interesting thing. Okay, so you've decided you want a wide body. Then the next debate becomes 2S or 4S. This is always a hotly debated topic. Which one do you go with? Of course, the 4S first debuted in 1996 and was produced through 1998. They made about 40% more 4S's than they made 2S's. So essentially, they share the body shell with the turbo. Both cars do. The one major mechanical difference between a 2S and a 4S is the 4S does get the turbo big red brakes. They're kind of hard to spot. Other than the calipers are red, a lot of times people refinish their calipers red, but they have a greatly increased swept area versus the standard brakes. The 2S shares the same brakes with a regular Carrera. So that's a big mechanical difference. And of course, a 4S would be all-wheel drive. A 2S would be rear-wheel drive. The all-wheel drive system in the 993 is significantly simpler than the all-wheel drive system in the 964. It uses a viscous coupling-based system. So frankly, a lot of people think they feel a big, huge difference between them when you drive them. I'm here to tell you they don't really feel that different in real-world use, except for when you're in slippery or wet conditions. A 4 is a little bit more planted. But all this talk about increased understeer, it's just marketing hype. They both drive like 993s. They both drive great. There is a little bit of a weight penalty. The all-wheel drive system on a 993 adds 111 pounds. So that gives you some relative idea what the difference in weight is. If you go to the 2S, it first debuted in 1997. The dead giveaway that you're dealing with a 2S is a very iconic piece that a lot of people like, which is the split rear grille. You can see it on this Vesuvio edition car. People really like the split grille. And again, I think one of the other big things that drives 2S sales is that they are a little bit rarer. And there is some sentiment that a pure Porsche should be rear-wheel drive. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I can tell you that's what the market likes to talk about. Again, what I always tell you, buy the one that speaks to you. So now we've thrown punches over the narrow body, wide body debate. One of the other hotly debated topics is what year is best? Well, there are quite a few differences, but they're kind of break into two. So let's talk about what those differences are. And again, trying to be mindful of a worldwide audience. In Europe, we got a 1994 model year as well as a 1995. And then there's a split 96 to 98. Those are basically your model years, but there's a lot of difference between our market and, for example, the European market. So we're going to touch a little bit on that. So we're going to predominantly talk to our US audience for a moment. Okay, so for the 1995 model year US car, this car right here is a very, very early build. It was built in January of 1994. Its VIN number, I believe, 160. So it's in the first 100 cars produced because production starts with VIN number 61, oddly enough. There are quite a few changes. These actually were destined to be European 1994s. That Porsche re-VIN to be sold as 1995 model year cars. Those will carry an option code called 718, which denotes that change. And there are some distinctions in a 718 VIN car versus a later US 95, for example, my yellow 993 in the background. One of the most obvious visuals on these cars, people refer to it as the basket handle. Okay, so all 1995 model year cars through March of 1995 feature the basket handle. Later production cars, they moved the third brake light up into the rear window. You'll see that on my yellow car. The biggest difference, however, is not just the basket handle. This is, however, on the all cabriolets and Targas, just as an aside. The mechanicals are very, very different between those two cars. So the basic bottom end of the motor is the same. However, the original 94 and 95 cars featured a 270 horsepower engine. Starting in 1996, they introduced a system called VarioRam. And VarioRam used basically a variable intake runners in the intake to basically boost up the torque curve on the car. So they went from 270 horsepower to 285 horsepower. So they gained 15 horsepower. The big difference in terms of how they feel, however, is if you look at the torque curve on the car, you have 30% more torque, or actually I say take that back, 18% more torque at 3,500 RPM. So if you drive one, kind of just your butt dyno, if you will, around town, the VarioRam cars will feel a little bit stronger kind of on the bottom end where you spend a lot of your time. However, there are some drawbacks to it. I find that the power curve is not quite as linear. I really like the earlier cars because they feel more akin to an early 911. They kind of get on the cam toward the top end of the rev range, and they have this shriek to the final 1,000 RPM to redline that I really enjoy. But as an everyday car, your butt dyno will tell you a 96 to 98 car is a little bit faster. So you can decide between that. The other big topic, again, specific to the US, would be the difference between 95 being what we call an onboard diagnostics 1 car. 1996, the federal government instituted more stringent emissions regulations across all manufacturers, and to comply, Porsche had to make some changes to the emissions system. So it's now OBD2 compliant, which means that when you emission test in a state like California, the tester has to plug into the computer, scan for any codes, and the car will fail if it has any codes related to emissions stored in the system, regardless or not how the car runs and drives or is emitting from a pollution standpoint. So some people that live in emission control states would prefer to have a 95 car because you don't have OBD2 type issues with emissions. 6 to 1, half to the other. I personally prefer the simplicity of the 1995 motor. You don't have all the solenoids in the VarioRam system. You have one single oxygen sensor. Again, I kind of like the characteristics of that engine. It feels a little bit more historical Porsche feel to me, a little less torquey, a little more revvy. But again, we're splitting hairs a little bit. Where it gets a little bit weird, and we're going to have a car here, for example, this is a 1996, what they call a C00 car, which would be a German market delivery car. That car has VarioRam, but it's still OBD1, interestingly enough, right? So it does matter what market you came from. But it also means that, for example, you can't import that car in a place like California because it will never be OBD2 compliant. So something worth knowing there. In terms of other things, we have to remember Porsche was predominantly an engineering company. And so as they would come up with changes, they generally would make the engineering change, it would be approved, they would go to their supplier and get the parts, and as soon as parts arrived, they would make the engineering change. So sometimes people will get hung up and they'll say, oh, well, Porsche didn't introduce this change until this model year. That's generally not true. They generally phased them in. So for example, they phased in the change on the third brake light. They phased in the change on the immobilizer. So one thing I do like about the early cars, they do not have the immobilizer. They just simply have a key. It's kind of a nice little benefit of those. So things like radios change, trim changes, finish on various pieces, do not get so caught up in the model year. Generally know they introduced them at some point, and it may not perfectly fall in line with a model year. So when it comes to which one is best, what I tell you, first and foremost, buy the best 993 you can find regardless of year. So for example, I prefer a 95, but I would much rather have a perfect 96 than a so-so 95. I do hope that makes some sense to you, because it's all about quality when you're shopping for these cars. Okay, now we're going to walk around each of these cars, and I'm going to just tell you things to note if you're looking for a 993, or things maybe you haven't heard a detail about. We're just going to get into the deep dive. So we're just going to start with no particular order, things that come to mind when I think about a 993. So let's start at the front. One of the issues with 993s, they use this little gasket here on between the front bumper cover and the fender. This always falls in, drives me crazy. These ones actually look pretty nice. But if you ever pull off your front bumper cover, which you'll be doing anytime you do any repairs, this is kind of a nightmare to get right. Headlight lenses, I'm going to cover this in a moment. These are very, very easily replaced. And as they start to degrade over time, one of the single best investments you can make on a 993 is simply buying a new lens. When we get to the black car, I'll show you what kind of mungy lenses look like. Moving back, one of the other issues on 993s, rust appearing at the base of the windscreen, front or rear. And this is predominantly due to how this new design was. So if you're familiar with an older 911, the windshield was actually held in by a rubber gasket that goes over a lip. In this generation, this piece here is simply an aesthetic piece of trim. The windshield is actually, for the first time ever, urethaned in place, and this trim is just decorative. The problem with this, however, is that moisture will get underneath this seal and has no way of escaping. And eventually, particularly if someone's ever replaced the windshield, they'll scrape through and they'll have exposed metal, and you'll start seeing a bubbling. So if you ever inspect one, even if you don't see any bubbling, run your finger along this piece of trim, and if you get any kind of rise, pull that seal back, and oftentimes you'll find rust living under that seal. So kind of worth knowing. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine. One of the other issues with 993s that they had when they were new, due to this new windshield design, if you ever drive your car and it sounds like someone's got a Lay's bag of potato chips and they're crinkling it and it drives you crazy, it's actually what's happening is the windshield, because it's urethaned in, the body is flexing, but the windshield's not because it's urethaned in, but then the trim is. And so the fix for this, Porsche, believe it or not, actually had a kit you could buy, and it was essentially a piece of wax rope, and you would shove it underneath this gasket, which would basically keep that gliding over the metal so you wouldn't get that noise. So if you've ever wondered about that squeak in your 993, there is a solution. You can look it up online, kind of a fun one. Other things, one thing you'll note on this car, which is one of the reasons I love this particular car, is this car, because it's a US car, is a sunroof delete, which is very, very unusual here in the US. In the US, the sunroof was standard equipment. So I can't really talk about it, but one of the issues on 993s with sunroofs is the sunroof gasket oftentimes gets fairly degraded just with UV and people polishing the car. So I'm kind of particular that they fit nice. I would just frankly rather not have that, hence my desire to have a non-sunroof car. Other things that are notable on 993s, these rear flare guards. When they were brand new, the early 718 VIN cars came with a much smaller flare guard, about half this size. And depending on the color of the car, they were either painted flare guards or clear. So certain colors, they were painted. Other ones, they came clear. And the new products have gotten much better. So if you have the original flare guard, it goes a long way oftentimes to remove the old flare guard and replace it. The factory product is thicker, and they just tend to age and don't look great over time. They can be kind of a bear to get off once they're broken up. So if yours is still in good shape, it's probably a good time to remove it. Do be careful if your car has been painted, however, they like to pull up. Okay, wandering around to the back of the car, one of the things to check is run the spoiler up. There's a curtain on the inside. When we do the inspection, I'll show it to you. It should not have a split in it. I see so many of these cars, for example, on places like Bring a Trailer, and they have the spoiler up, and they don't even know they're marketing the fact that their spoiler curtain is broken. You can look up the fix for that. It's kind of a not too bad of a job. It'll take you a few hours to get that done. Again, they will form rust again here at the bottom of the windscreen. And then the other thing that they'll do is sometimes these gaskets will shrink up and they'll start dropping in the corners. Be really careful. In the rear window, you can basically, once you pull it out, you're going to end up replacing the windshield because you end up breaking the clips which hold the trim in place. So try as hard as you can not to pull the rear window out of this car if possible. Other things on the cars, exhaust tips change depending on the year. So the 95 has a different exhaust tip. Frankly, it's kind of an ugly exhaust tip versus the later ones. As an example, this is what's called a wide oval tip. Didn't originally come on this car, but it was added. It's a nice, you can get those through equipment. It's a beautiful piece. But the standard 96 is slightly more polished, and it actually has a little piece here visually so you can't see through the bumper cover. Just a small little design detail for you. A lot of people ask questions about like paint, rust, things like that on these cars. These cars are not prone to rust except in those places. The only time I would be concerned about rust would be in the following circumstances. One, if the car's ever lived somewhere with significant like wintertime salt exposure, rust could be an issue, but we're talking extended time. They're very, very well rust proofed. So I wouldn't worry about them too much there. The other time is if they've had accident or collision damage, oftentimes they're not repaired to the same factory standard. So sometimes I'll see a car and I know, for example, this fender's been replaced, and then when I look inside the fender, they didn't reapply the seam sealer and the rust proofing, and I find evidence of corrosion on an otherwise corrosion-free car. So that's one of the reasons I really prefer original paint. Let's jump over to the next car. This car is interesting. This is a rest of world, a German market C4S, so wide body, finished in a gorgeous color called Zenith Blue. Just gorgeous. One of the things I love about the European cars is they did not get the bumperettes that we got. This was just a bumper requirement here in the US. I think it's a much more elegant design without them. The European market cars did get the side repeater indicators here on the fenders. That's one big visual tell that you've got a European model, would be these. Sort of an interesting one. Come to the back, of course, we do know they have the wider rear fenders. And one of the other things that they have that was introduced for 1996 was this wheel, commonly called the Turbo Twist. These actually come in two different variants. A lot of people think the C4S got the technology wheel, which is the hollow spoke. That's not true. The standard wheel on the C4S was the Turbo Look wheel, meaning that it's solid spoke. When we get underneath the car, I'll tell you how you know. The easiest way to know is if you stick your hand behind the spoke, it'll have ridges on a solid wheel. It'll be smooth on a hollow spoke wheel. Hollow spoke wheels are a little bit lighter. They were optional on this car, but again, this wheel design did debut for 1996. Probably confusing you a little bit is the fact that my 95 also has turbo twists. I will admit I added those. I just liked them on the car, so that's the direction that I went. It originally was delivered on the 17-inch Cup 2 wheel. That is the wheel most people associate with the 993. It's a 5-spoke wheel, 7-inch in the front, 9-inch in the rear, and people think that was a standard equipment wheel. Believe it or not, that was actually the optional wheel. The standard wheel was the Design 93 wheel in a 16x7 and 16x9. You'll almost never find a 993 with those wheels for two reasons. One, they were rarely ordered with the standard wheel, and also you can really no longer find a good tire fitment in that wheel. So sort of worth noting. let's jump over to the, oh, before we do that, because I just caught my eye, I am going to point out something kind of interesting for our German market people. You'll notice this. You think, what the heck is this? This is the cell phone antenna. And believe it or not, in this era, starting in 1996, a cell phone was basically a mandatory option in a 993 in the German market cars. So you actually had to delete it if you didn't want a cell phone. There was two different options that you had, either one that was fixed in the car or one that had a fixed base but was a portable unit. But it was standard and you had to delete if you did not want a cell phone. So almost all your German market 96 and 97 cars are going to have the rooftop mounted antenna. And again, this car is a non-sunroof car, but the sunroof is also an option in Germany. So this would not be a sunroof delete, it would be a non-sunroof car. I know we're getting into the weeds here. Let's move over to the Vesuvio car, this one being a C2S. They built 60 of these cars. They're called the Vesuvio, which is basically the exterior color is called Vesuvio Metallic. Gorgeous color, pearl effect, kind of a purple gray, a very, very desirable car. And then they did a couple of really cool design details with this car. They picked a color called steel gray. It's a water-based, I think the color code's 91W. And they painted the mirrors, the door handles, as well as the split rear grille in that steel gray. They also finished the centers of the Cup 2 wheels in steel gray if you got the Cup 2 wheels. This particular car was optional originally with technology wheels, and so you didn't get that finish. And again, I can tell these are technology wheels because if I put my finger behind them, they're smooth. So one of the things I always check when I buy one of these cars is I want to know what options it came with. If it came with technology wheels, I make sure I have 4 technology wheels. I would say a good percent of the time people don't know the difference. And the car might have 2 technology wheels and 2 solid spoke wheels. It's not the end of the world, but it's a pet peeve of mine to have mismatched wheels. So with exterior sort of out of the way, let's dive into the interior and talk about that. You might find this a little bit interesting because it's one of the areas that Porsche changed the least, is that I love the interior on a 993, which seems a little bit weird because it's very similar to pretty much all the other air-cooled 911s, and I guess that's what I like about it. You know, it's really consistent. The styling changed a lot between the 964 to the 993, but they didn't change that much on the interior, and I just find it such a welcoming place. It just speaks to my history with the brand. I just love it. So let's talk about what some of the different options are, what the possible configurations are, what are some of the issues on the interior. So let's just jump in. This car, this is a late build 95, and this car, of course, is in black. One thing that's interesting about this car is this car does have full leather. You can kind of pick that out because you can see the stitched dash, as well as kind of it's got a little bit more of a pad to the top, if you will. Full leather is a pretty unusual option on particularly narrow body cars or non-turbos, just simply because it was quite expensive. It was around $4,000 to get a full leather interior. And you will notice, for example, all of this is leather. So some people say, well, gosh, my 993 has leather. Aren't they all leather? No, there's a couple things. So basically here in the US, the standard was what we call partial leather. So if you had a black interior, if you have the least expensive, the free option, you would have interior color code LT, which would denote just the seating surfaces of the seats themselves are leather. Your next option would be just leather seats, which we'll feature a car next that has that option. And then your final option would be full leather. So on a full leather car, absolutely everything in the car is leather. So all the seating surfaces, the door panels, the rear deck, the dashboard, all of that is in leather. I find it to be one of my favorite options. It dresses up the car. It's very elegant. However, real world for a driver quality car, you're going to see more degradation. This car, of course, is almost a 0-mile car, so it's easier to have it look this way. A couple other things that are going to be really notable. There are a couple different seat choices. You will notice this car has what are commonly referred to as the hardback sport seat. And a lot of people think this was originally introduced on the 993. It's actually not true. This seat was, but they had a different seat to start with. So until June of 1994, the seat was basically akin to the previous 85 to 94 style with the 993 style stitching. Quite rare. Those are generally referred to as the softback sports seat. Those are actually my favorite. The hardbacks are generally more desirable, but the softback are really, really cool. I like them. You also have a lot of different options for power and configuration, and you'll note this car has the heated seat option. More common in Europe than here in the US. I don't like my butt to be cold, so I'm a big fan. A couple other things that you'll notice are differences on the car. They'll have a couple different door panel options. This is the standard for audio. So you're just going to have your mid-bass driver and your tweeter here. I'll show you a car where it's got the hi-fi audio system. Other things, steering wheel, they only offered this 4-spoke style design. A lot of people will put the later 996 wheel, but officially Porsche only sold this style wheel. Although there were a few options, you could do the rim in either carbon or various different woods, but most commonly you'll just find it in the standard 4-spoke like this. There were optional choices for brake and shift knobs. Again, no particular options on this car. I want to talk a little bit about radios. Radios are always kind of interesting. This car has an Alpine 7907. And I've actually taken this car to a couple Porsche events, and they said, oh, it's not all original, you changed the radio. That's actually not true. For about the only time I can think of in Porsche history, they sourced a Japanese-built radio made by Alpine. And essentially, in 1994 and 1995 here in the US, you had two possible radios. You had what's called the CR1, which is a Porsche-branded cassette radio, but was made by Alpine. Or if you paid extra and wanted the in-dash CD player, you got the Alpine 7907. The later cars got the Becker. I'll show you that on the next car. Let's jump to the next one. We'll jump on the interior and show you a few more things worth knowing. Let's wander over, just because we're going to do black to black, we're going to talk about this Vesuvio car. This car would have just kind of the middle tier leather option. This would just have the full leather seats. So you can see those are the full leather seats, but for example, the top of the dash, that would be a plastic dash there. Real world, those are kind of a nice, they don't show the wear like a leather dash would, but a few things I'm going to call out. I am going to pull that key because that's going to drive me crazy. There we go. Perfecto. You will note it does have the Becker radio in it. This was the standard radio in this period. It's called the CR210. Again, in different markets, they had different radio options. So this is just speaking to the US. Because we're inside and it's kind of fun, we will show a couple of the interior differences when you get a 2S. The few obvious ones are, first and foremost, it says Carrera S in the TAC. The 4S, nor the Turbo got that, just the Carrera S got that, kind of a neat feature. The gauge trim rings, kind of hard to tell, but they're also painted the steel gray, as is the shift knob and the e-brake lever. So kind of a nice distinguishing detail. And one detail I almost have nobody ever noticed, but actually the graining and texture on the dash fascia, as well as the door panels, is slightly different. It's got kind of a PebbleTech kind of finish to it, if you will. I actually don't really care for it, but it is unique to the 2S, one of the distinguishing interior dimensions. One other thing you'll notice on this car is this car has the 8-way comfort seats. So the standard seat in this car is just 4-way, so it would just be up and down and recline. And if you option for the 8-way, then the seats fully power. All of them are fine, but that's just pointing out the difference between the 8-way and the 4-way. And you can actually get a 12-way seat, which would be full power plus power lumbar. So if you checked every box for seats, it would be 12-way with heat. There was no 12-way with heat on sport seats, however. But again, these are generally called the comfort seats. I actually find them to be quite comfortable. And then one other feature on this car I do want to feature, because it's unique, is the rear seat delete. This is a pretty unusual option on a 993. And so instead of the regular seating, you get storage compartments where you can, put various items. Kind of an unusual option. I love it. In fact, I wish my car had the rear seat delete. Speaking of interiors that we love, we're going to jump over to this C4S, and this car has an interior I love. In fact, if you've watched my 996 Turbo video, you know I own a 996 Turbo with a very distinct Boxster red interior with lots of exclusive leather options, and this car is the sister ship to that. Look at this interior in this car. This car is finished in Boxster red, and literally someone went to Porsche Exclusive and said, let's wrap things up. So this is the kind of fun stuff Porsche would do for you by order. So you can see, for example, even the vents are leather, you know, a full leather dash, leather gauge rings, as well as the aluminum faces on them. You got a full leather airbag, even leather sun visors. Kind of a neat deal. And the best part of this, not everyone loves an all red interior, but man, if you want to get me excited, you're going to do an all leather interior in red. You'll notice a couple other things. We mentioned the cell phone. You can see where the original German market cell phone would have been mounted. Kind of an interesting, certainly a period. Take it to Radwood. Everyone's going to remember back in the day when your cell phone had to be mounted to your car. I do want to talk a little bit about the hi-fi audio because we did discuss that. So again, if you ordered the hi-fi audio option, I think it was around $900, you got basically a speaker enclosure. So the door pocket's smaller, and this becomes basically a sealed enclosure for the mid-bass and a little bit better speakers as well as a bigger amp. In theory, I say theory, it's supposed to sound a lot better. In practice, they all sound lousy. Porsche, you do a lot of things well, but sound systems is not one of them. And then one only other little difference, if you look at the rear speakers, you'll notice the rear speaker grills on a hi-fi car are different. So they have a raised area for the tweeter. So one way of visually from the outside of the car to say if it had hi-fi would be those grill covers. But I love this interior. This car definitely speaks to me. Very, very sexy. And you can kind of get an idea of what some of the changes are interior-wise. Let's jump over to this black car because there's a couple things in that car I want to show you that are a little bit unique. So let's wander over and we'll talk about what some of the options are, the colors. The thing to know about Porsche is there's so many choices. You know, one of the things that I dislike sometimes about cars made from other manufacturers is they always say, okay, if you're getting a black car, you get a black interior. With Porsche, you could pair it any way you want. Again, this is a very early VIN car. So this car has a classic gray interior, which is pretty typical. Has comfort seats. You can see they're 8-way and they are heated in this car. You can also see that it's a hi-fi audio. You can note the different door panels. And one thing about this car is a Tiptronic. So we can see the Tiptronic. And funny enough, Porsche made a lot of hoopla of this. Starting in middle of model year 1995, they rebranded it. It's called the Tiptronic S, and they gave it shift buttons on the steering wheel. That's really the only difference. So this is an early car. So if you buy an early Tiptronic car, it will not have the shift paddles on the steering wheel. One thing that's nice about a Tiptronic car is every Tiptronic car does get the onboard computer, which is here. And the onboard computer will show you things like your distance to empty, average speed, miles per gallon, and outside temperature. I find it super useful, mostly for speed, because I find you pretty much can't read the speedometer. At least from my height, it's a little hard for me to read. But again, this is just the standard interior with leather seating in classic gray. In the market, I will speak to a little bit of values. There are some differentiators based on interior color. Generally, the more interesting or vibrant interior colors tend to bring a premium. And of the standard colors, generally black is preferred. I think it's because it's non-controversial, whereas gray sometimes will sell at a discount. Cashmere highly depends on what the exterior color is. But again, buy the one that speaks to you, because ultimately you're the one driving it. Okay, another hotbed topic is paint and color. So we're going to take a deep dive. One of the things I love about 993 and Porsche in general is the variety of colors that they come in. I'm very excited to offer you guys to see some brilliant colors here. I personally love Speed Yellow. Believe it or not, Speed Yellow was on the palette during 993 production, 95 and 96, and it was a free choice. Not that many people took it, but it was a free choice. I think it's a great choice. So let's talk a little bit about the various topics around paint, original paint, how to read paint codes, and that sort of stuff. So let's open this up. What I did take out the trunk carpet on this car just to make it easier for us to talk about these topics. So let's look at a few things. First off, we have our option code tag. That option code tag is L12G. So your first one tells you which color your car is. And a lot of people get confused by those codes because they're not as clear as you would think. And I'll get into that in a moment. But what I can tell you is what that code tells me is the car is Speed Yellow and it's single stage. There's also another color code here. Speed Gelb, it's called. Auf Deutsch. So just if you're a real nerd, 9 basically tells you it was painted at the factory. There's the color code. 3 is the paint manufacturer, who that is, and I can give you a resource for how you determine that. So a couple things to know about paint in this era of Porsche is they come in a bunch of different potential formats. So they had single stage paint, 2-stage paint, pearlescent effect paint, and water-based paint. So man, it gets a little heavy figuring all that stuff out. So you want to have a resource. I'm a big fan of resources with Porsche. A lot of people just surmise or they tell you this is what they think. I'm a big believer is going to the source and digging. So I've been collecting Porsche data and literature for many, many years. And so I like to know what the factory has to say. So a couple resources I really like. The first and foremost, I always like to have the brochure for a given year. So for 1995, this is the color brochure. So this shows you what colors were available. So for example, you can see Speed Yellow on the list there. Of course, you can see a color everyone's in love with, a Riviera Blue. Very, very rarely chosen, right? So you can get a sense. But where it gets confusing is they have a marketing number which is different than the actual paint code. So for example, if you zoom in on Speed Yellow there, you'll see Speed Yellow has a X4. That's the marketing color, but that's not the color code. The color code, I'll show you how we're going to read that, is the L12G, which is here. So one of the things you can do is Porsche, they have a book for almost everything. I love it. So this is a Porsche paint manual. So for example, we're going to talk about paint depth. I pulled this up. This would tell me that my solid paint finish, original paint, should be about 120, which for those of you speaking in mils, between 4.5 and 5.5 mils. Kind of cool. But we can actually flip through here, and let's see, I think I marked it. Yeah, and it shows the various colors, and I can find my Speed Yellow. I can find Speed Yellow, 12G. Paint system is a U2. Oh, so this is, for example, I'm sorry, I'm looking in the wrong year. So this is 1999. So it actually changed. So you can see Speed Yellow starting in 1999 is a 2-stage. It would be base coat, clear coat. So for a 993, it would actually be different. So if I go to 1995, I find my 12G. Let's see where I find it right here. It's a U1. That means it's single stage. So for example, if you use the paint from a 996 Speed Yellow, it's going to be different. It's going to be 2-stage, not a single stage. That would mean non-clear coated. So where it gets confusing in a given year, for example, you can see Grand Prix White came in both single stage as well as a 2-stage water base, depending on your color code. So if you went to the paint shop and said, oh, I'm Grand Prix White, they would have to guess which system you had. And that's why it's going to be really important to look at your color code. Kind of a great resource. I'm kind of a nerd for having all this data. Let's talk about original paint because we know the factory manual tells us that factory paint is between 4.5 and 5.5 mils. So we can use our trusty paint meter, and what we're going to do is we're going to take this paint meter and we can wander around the car, and what we're looking for is consistency. But before we get too spun up, you've probably heard me say this before, these still were built predominantly by hand, and so there's some acceptable variance in my opinion. Not everyone shares this opinion. So what I'm really looking for more than anything is the hallmarks of original paint. which is color match, texture, no evidence of backmasking or repair. And so while I would love a car that meters perfectly on every panel, this car does. I've also have cars I've inspected that meter slightly high in places that, in my professional opinion, I believe to be original paint. You'll have to form your own judgment on that. As it relates to the topic of original paint, again, like I say about which model is best, drive and enjoy and love the car. This obsession over everything being original has gotten a little bit out of hand. I somewhere think that Ferry Porsche is rolling over and wondering how we got to this place. I do recognize in the market that's valuable. For me, the reason I like original paint is I know there's nothing underneath the surface that I'm concerned about. So there's not going to be an issue with poorly done collision damage repair or anything untoward that I don't know about. I also like to collect these original cars. Really, for a lot of my audience, they get a chance to see what one would look like as it left Porsche. But for ones to drive, I like ones with chips and dings and take it out, love it, enjoy it, have fun with it. So that's the thing about paint. So let me grab my paint meter and we'll go around this car and we'll look at some values. The paint meter, really what we want to see is consistency. So we're going to take several readings per panel. So on the hood, for example, I get a 4, that's right in the range, 4.5, that's right in the range where I want to be. 5, again, right in line with factory measurement. Usually the fuel lid's usually a little bit lower, but again, we're just getting multiple readings on every panel. If you get a higher reading, then what you want to do is you want to start looking a little bit more closely and seeing if you can identify an area with a potential repair in the past, if that makes any kind of sense. But again, this car meters spot on, perfect. If you get a car, for example, I believe this car's had some paint work on it, so let's just check it out. Let's see what we get, for example, on this fender, 8.5. So, you know, there's a relative measure. A dollar bill is about 5 mils. So it's about the thickness of $2 bills. So we're not talking, a lot of people say, oh my gosh, there's a ton of filler there. No, that'd be pretty typical with repair work. But again, it would be a pretty good indicator, you know, that fender had some repair work done to it. If, however, I metered the entire car and it metered maybe 6 or 6.5 across every panel, I would actually feel comfortable that was likely factory. It's the consistency. So if I'm getting 4s and 5s everywhere and I get an 11 on the door, the odds are the door has been painted. And again, it doesn't necessarily make it a bad car. I just want to look and I want to understand what happened so I know what it is that I'm getting into. That's the only reason to ask the question. I always love the business end of an air-cooled 911. I love the fan. I just love the aesthetics of it. It's what I miss about modern Porsche. The engine compartment doesn't even look like an engine compartment. You get a little fan and a little place to add oil. This looks like the business end. So this is a first generation 993 motor, the 270 horsepower US version. And we're going to just talk about a few things that are worthwhile topics if you're looking in the engine bay and things worth knowing. So the very first thing, I got out the owner's manual because one of my pet peeves and one of the questions I get all the time is how do I check the oil in my car? And so I always tell people, well, again, Porsche has resources right in your owner's manual for how to do that. So I would encourage you, I've got it marked in mine, a couple things. So let's start with the oil level gauge. People tell me, oh, that gauge is never accurate. That's actually not true. When it's functioning the way it should, it's quite accurate and it's quite a useful tool. You just need to know how to use it. So just remember these things, and you can read this in the manual if you don't remember. The way you read the oil level gauge is the car has to be at operating temperature, has to be on level ground, and it has to be for at least 30 seconds. And an ideal oil level on a 993, I'll show you on the gauge, will be about halfway on the gauge. So again, the car is obviously cold, we wouldn't do it here, but where you want to see this gauge is right about 3 o'clock. If I jump into a car and that's pegged at the top, for example, if the key's off and it's pegged at the top, that means there's a fault in the system. But if it's pegged at the top otherwise, it's generally overfilled. If in that circumstance the gauge doesn't move, the car is low on oil. So when you're driving, however, and the car is under load, the gauge means nothing. It's going to bounce around, it's going to move. In fact, by design, Once you add engine RPM, the gauge will start dropping. So one other way you can check it, of course, and the gold standard is the dipstick. So let's see what Porsche says. Again, they'll talk about how to read the dipstick. Same exact procedure, they get a little bit more particular. Basically, the engine has to be running, so do be careful if you have long hair or something, not to get caught in the belts. The engine is running. Your dipstick, of course, is here. You pull it out when the car is at temperature, running for at least 30 seconds on level ground. So same procedure, you pull the dipstick out and you measure your oil level. I like them to be about halfway between A and B. You can see in the diagram, it's got kind of a twist part of the, so right about here in the center, which should correspond to about halfway on the gauge. If you're going to air either way, air slightly low. I tend to find that they burn a little bit more oil when they're on the gauge. This jumps right into our next topic, which is oil consumption and valve guides. So if there's any weak area mechanically on 993s, the bottom ends of these motors are very robust. The valve guides can exhibit wear. I don't find this to be on every 993. My theory is that they had a batch of soft or bad valve guides, because I've seen 993s get top-end rebuilds at 30,000 miles, and I've seen cars with 150 that are still going strong. But generally, as you're approaching, higher mileage, it's going to come into play. And the best way you know you're going to be due for valve guides is oil consumption. So the most important thing is knowing how to read your oil level, keep it topped off, and then monitor it over time. Porsche's standard is no more than a liter every 1,000 kilometers or 600 miles, give or take. I would be alarmed at that level of consumption. A good healthy 993, depending on use, will generally consume about a liter every 12 to 1,500 miles. That would be perfectly normal. But what I generally find is most people don't drive them enough to know if they're using the oil, or frankly know how to monitor them closely. So that's going to be your best indication. A lot of people think, well, it doesn't smoke. You have to be burning a lot of oil before it'll visibly smoke, particularly on cars that have catalytic converters. But that's going to be your gold standard there. The other topic is secondary air injection they can plug up. So a lot of people think 95s don't have secondary air injection. That's simply not true. It's probably hard to tell in the video, but if you look underneath the intake, you'll actually find the SAI. Yeah, you probably can't see it in the video, so no worries. Well, maybe you can see it from up top. There's your SAI pump. So all US delivered cars have an SAI pump, but on a 95 model year car in the US, it's not monitored. So it will not throw a check engine light because it's still OBD1. So if you live, for example, in California, your SAI system could be completely plugged up. It will not affect the way the car drives. It's simply emissions control, and the car will still pass emissions just fine. The European cars, and we'll walk over to that in a moment, simply never had that system to begin with. So a kind of a key advantage of a rest of world car. So let's jump over there and we'll talk about secondary air injection and also the update to the VarioRam car. So again, this is a rest of world car. These are sort of a hybrid, if you will. So they do get the VarioRam system, but they do not have secondary air injection, and they are still OBD1. They would still have the potential issue with valve guides. If you had a US model car and it's a 96 model year and later, if the secondary air injection system plugs up, which they'll do just due to poor design and oil consumption, you basically can have a couple different options. Option one, you can simply mechanically clean the ports out and get them flowing again. That's the first option. Long term, you're going to be revisiting that because the reason they plug, again, is poor design and oil consumption. As oil consumption increases, the rate at which the system plugs up will go quicker. So eventually you'll end up doing a top-end overhaul on one of these cars for that reason. Not everyone goes that route. Some people say as soon as it plugs up, you need to do it. I don't ascribe to that theory. If compression and leak down are good, oil consumption's moderate, I would not go the distance of going a top end. But if your car already has 100,000 miles, it's consuming some oil, maybe your leak down and compression numbers are borderline, then it's probably a good time to enter into a situation where you're doing a top end rebuild. The other things that you'll note on the top side of the VarioRam cars, you can see they're aesthetically, they're very, very different, a little bit more complex, a little bit more challenging to work on, but certainly not the end of the world. You'll notice one thing about this car. This does have the motor sound package. The way you can tell a motor sound package car is simply they have this little chrome piece of trim on the airbox cover, and on the side it's actually got holes sort of drilled in the factory cover. A little bit hard to tell in the video. If you don't have a motor sound car, you can buy this airbox cover for under a couple $100 directly from Porsche. They did modify the mufflers slightly, but frankly it is so mild you almost can't tell. You're better off going one of the aftermarket PAs if you want a different sound out of your 993. Other things that I'm looking for when I'm looking at an engine compartment on one of these cars, again, this is not a PPI video, so even if you're not a mechanic, you're just looking for things that are out of place. So things that are out of place on a 993 would be oil, right? You'll oftentimes find oil down here because people spill it when they're either changing the filter or they're adding oil. That's very, very common. But generally, you don't want to see oil. You generally don't want to see, for example, frayed belts. This boot here is torn on a huge percentage of the cars. They tend to tear. That's a really cheap and easy fix. The engine sound pads like to fall down. You can kind of see what this one's doing here. Very, very common. I'll give a shout out to a guy named David Eder, sells like a product called the Pad Keeper. It's a great product if you don't want to drop the engine. It just puts a nice finished edge here and visually cleans up the engine compartment a little bit. If you ever do pull the engine to do something like a clutch, please replace the sound pad. It's super cheap and easy when the motor's out. It's a great time to do it. But again, you're just looking for things that stand out. And if you want to dive into a PPI, which I do encourage, just make notes. And when you go to the shop, say, hey, I noticed there was a little bit of oil on the passenger side, you know, down below the AC compressor, or I noticed this, or there's a tear here. Just things that stand out to your eye. I'll be excited when we get the car on the lift and we can dig into even greater detail there. Let's dig right into the trunk of a 993. A couple things that are interesting about the 993 is the trunk is actually 30% larger than a 964. You think, well, how is that possible? Well, again, remember we started off by telling you they raised the front trunk 40 millimeters. Well, you got more height, you got more cubic volume, so 30% more volume than a 964. Kind of makes it nice for if you're traveling with your spouse and trying to get a little more luggage in there. One difference you'll note, this car has black carpet. The early 718 VIN cars got a black trunk carpet. It later switched to gray. We're going to show you that. This car does feature one of my #1 pet peeves is the bent front pocket. If you have a 993 and you've done this to your pocket, well, we may not be friends. This is a pet peeve of mine. There's a place and a purpose for that pocket, and I'll show you that in a moment. So just remember that ugly looking thing. One of the other things we always want to look at, again, we talked about it earlier, is the option code sticker. So you can see this car. A couple things that are unique on this car. You'll notice it's color code L741, which actually tells me one might think this car is just a regular black, but it's actually a water-based black. If it was regular black, it'd be L747. So again, it's important to know the difference, a water-based paint finish on this particular car. And you'll also notice it has option code number 718, which we had mentioned, which denotes it started life as a European 94. Kind of interesting. So let's wander over to another car a little bit later. I'll show you some things, and then I have the trunk carpets out of my car. So we're going to wander over to the Vesuvio car. And the first thing you'll probably notice is that trunk carpet is gray. So starting in about mid-model year 1995, they switched to gray, and were gray throughout the rest of production, unless you specified as a Z code option for an interior trunk to match. I've only seen just a couple in all my time, but you'll notice the pocket, nice and square like it should be. When we go through the accessories, I'll tell you why it should be square, because it actually has a function. Same deal here, we can see the color code for Vesuvio here, L40X. It's also a water-based on this particular car. And then again, these option codes are very handy because they'll tell you things like, for example, I can tell you that the car was optioned originally with the 18-inch wheels, and I believe those are option code 408. Otherwise, it should have the 17-inch Cup 2s. So I don't expect you to memorize those things. There's a couple pretty good option decoders online, but I will give you a warning. They're not sometimes very discriminating about knowing what year your car is, and Porsche reused option codes and it varied by year. So even Porsche can be guilty of this. You'll request data from Porsche and you'll tell them an option number and they'll say things like 19-inch wheels. And someone will argue with me. They'll say, oh, my car had 19-inch wheels. I'm like, no, they translated it wrong. Your 993 never came with 19-inch wheels. So you have to be careful with some of the codes if you go online. They may not be accurate. And believe it or not, even the information sometimes you get from Porsche is not accurate. So back on the inspection vein, I did pull all the trunk carpet and accessories out of my car just so you could see what a trunk on a 993 looks like in kind of its naked format. So things that are notable, questions that I oftentimes get. Let's look at the sidewall in the trunk, and you'll notice the paint. A lot of people say, well, gosh, why do I see seam sealer and why do I see primer? That's simply because when they finished these cars new, all they did was open up the trunk and blast a little bit of color. And so it's variable car to car. Some cars have more paint than others. However, they never have a lot of paint. So one indicator a car's had significant repair is if you look in the trunk and the paint looks as good as the rest of the car, it has been refinished definitively. Okay, a couple things that I think are worth telling people. Other things that I'm looking at when I'm looking at it in a trunk of a 993, I want to inspect the trunk floor for any evidence that it's ever had any damage underneath. We'll get the car on the lift and inspect there. I want it to be nice and flat, showing no evidence it's been pulled back into shape. Generally, I'm going to run my hands along the frame rails here. If they've ever been kinked, you'll actually be able to feel like a bow to them. It's certainly not like doing a chassis measurement, but it's kind of useful just to get some idea. If you ever see any kind of welding or repair on the frame rails themselves, I get a little bit wary. I look for things like overspray on rubber trim. Look for like assembly items that haven't been taken apart. So you can obviously tell this car is pretty sanitary. Nothing I see that's too alarming here. One of the other things that I like to look at when I'm looking at a trunk is I do like to get into the actual fuse box. Pretty easy to access in a 993. It's right here. And what I want to see, I have a little fuse diagram underneath, but what I want to see is that nobody has hacked into it. This was still an era where people were adding aftermarket stereos, radar detectors, God only knows what. These cars can happen to have some weird electrical issues, particularly electrical draw type issues, and I get very panicked when I see that someone has just put a jumper harness in there or, heaven forbid, butt spliced into the wiring on the car. That's usually a bad sign. Other things that I'm looking for, if they can have any corrosion in the front, it will be underneath the battery. So for example, I've removed my battery. This is just for a battery tender I usually keep it on. So I want to look in here and make sure there's no evidence that a battery leaked in these cars. You'll also notice there's a drain tube here. Most people forget to connect this. This is so your battery vents to the outside, not into your trunk. So do make sure that's hooked up when you put a new battery in. And then this is your battery hold down. I see a lot of cars without the hold down. So your battery sits here, and this is secured to keep your battery from moving around. Your jack and your first aid kit would typically store in here. We'll jump over and look at what accessories would normally come in the trunk. But again, I meet a lot of people and they just flip up the carpet and look in there. It takes all of 30 seconds to pull the carpet out. So if you're looking at one of these cars, pull the trunk carpet out, pull the spare tire, pull all the accessories out, and look in here for evidence of water, collision repair damage, anything that's, again, it's notable that shouldn't be look like this. Just for fun, because we're in here, one of the things I do love about 993s is they are single-handedly the easiest car you'll ever have to remove a headlight. To remove a headlight on a 993, you just push this lever and then the headlight comes out. Easy peasy, and you pull your headlight out. Really, really handy. I had to replace a headlight on a Ram truck of mine the other day, and it took me like 3 hours simply just to get there to get the headlight out. So super, super handy. In fact, one of the single best improvements you can make on a 993 is cleaning up that lens. Let's jump over and look at some of those accessories that would originally be in the trunk. Let's wander over here. I've got them kind of set out so we can see what that looks like. And as we wander over, this black car is a good example. This is pretty typical what the headlight lenses start to look like over time. If you look at the bottom, they just kind of get yellowy and brown. You can buy that new lens and it takes 10 minutes if you were drinking heavily to change that. So kind of a nice quick update that you can make. Let's look at accessories for one of these cars. What would come in the trunk? So a couple things. The very first thing that you're going to look for in the trunk of these cars, you're going to have a spare tire, which we have here. Every one of them gets one that looks like this. Please do keep your spare tire in your car. It's actually part of the design crash structure for the car. And it will have a hold down that holds it in place. I actually don't have that out. I probably should have. But of course, if you have a tire, what else do you need? It's a temporary use. You're going to need an air compressor. Here in the US, I don't like that's popping out. This is the style compressor you got. It's very similar to the earlier style, except for the 993's got the light. These tabs always like to break, so I generally don't close them. They're just a cheap, plastic compressor. This is what we got in the US. If your car was European delivered, this is the compressor it would have gotten. So whether you were a US car, if you did factory delivery, you would have gotten this compressor. You would have also gotten a couple other accessories we didn't get on US delivered cars, and those would be the first aid kit. It's kind of nice, required in Germany, as well as the safety warning triangle. So when I yelled at people for bending that, it's because the warning triangle is designed to fit in that pocket. It fits in this pocket and it keeps it nice and square. That should sit like that. So people put the toolkit in there where it doesn't belong. That's, again, for a European delivery car, you got that. You generally would have gotten a tire gauge, but oftentimes not here in the US. You did get a jack, and it always came in a little felt bag, which I think a kindergartner made, and they came in 3 different colors. They came in orange or green, generally early, and very late production. Every so often you'll find one in yellow. You did get a plastic bag for the tire. It's not because Porsche was being polite, it's because if you get a flat, the only place for the spare is on the passenger seat. So you got to be sure you can wrap that up, and some gloves to keep your hands clean. A couple other things that you're going to have. Toolkits. There were 2 different toolkits for 993s. Early 993s got a more comprehensive toolkit. This is the look of the early. I don't have an exact date when the changeover was, but it was sometime in 1996. And they went to a slightly more abbreviated kit in the later cars, which you can see here. So these are the things that you should have in your front trunk on a 993. Let's get underneath the 993. Nothing is more fun than getting underneath your car and seeing what we got going on. So we're going to walk through this car. I'm going to point out just things that I see. If I'm inspecting a 993, problematic areas. Again, this is not a comprehensive PPI. It's just things that you should be aware of, or potential issues, or things like that. I have removed a few of the service covers. That way you can better see what we're dealing with. In a second, I will show you what the service covers do look like. There's a lot of debate about whether you should run the rear engine cover. I'm a believer in running the rear engine cover. It's part of the lower underbody aerodynamics. Some people think it traps engine heat. I like it, keeps the engine clean, the airflow is correct. You make your own choice on that. So starting at the front, 993s, this is a narrow body. They've got a slightly different bumper cover. We talked about that. 993s tend to take a lot of impact at the front, particularly those that have been lowered. So what I'm looking for is evidence of impact here. And then they tend to take a lot on the trunk floor. They'll take this out and then this will get drug. So what I want it to look like is this. So the factory finish underneath the chassis of a 993 should be kind of a gray body schutz like this. And then you will see some overspray of the color just ever so slightly, particularly on the ridges, because when they painted the cars, they didn't mask underneath. So as the paint kind of fogged underneath the car, it would stick to kind of the high spots. A couple other things, they do have these little drain tubes. These are important. They keep water draining out of your trunk and not coming into your trunk. And oftentimes they get caught on the road and torn out. They're super, super cheap. Fun factoid, they actually are the original drain tubes for a G-body headlight bucket. Porsche likes to reuse their parts. Moving farther back, I did remove the service cover for the steering rack because 993 steering racks like to leak. So make sure you pull the cover off to inspect for leak at the boot. Generally, if it's leaking, when you pull the cover off, the cover itself will have power steering fluid on it. And this job has gotten pretty expensive. It's a several $1,000 endeavor. And so I want to make sure we don't have any leaks. Other things that I'm noting when I'm up front on these cars, again, I'm looking at suspension. I'm looking at all the various bushings and things, making sure things aren't worn, they're not bent, they're not loose. I'm inspecting the inside of the wheels to make sure the wheels aren't damaged, particularly if someone's driven them, for example, through a car wash. Oftentimes they'll get damaged on the inside edge or they'll be bent. It's a great time to inspect tires. A lot of people just look at the tires when it's on the ground, but on a lift you can see how the tires are wearing. I also would generally make note of what tire is on the car. I like to have a good quality tire. This one, I think I'm running the Continental Extreme Contact, which is a pretty good choice. Again, this car is a little bit of a bad example because it's so clean. If you've watched my videos, you know how I like to keep my stuff. Always brings that question, dry ice. This car has not been dry ice. This was just cleaned by hand. I like my stuff to be clean because it's more enjoyable, frankly, to work on a clean car, and it's easier for me to identify issues, leaks, and the like. Probably also helps I have a lift, so it makes it a little bit easier to do that. As I walk my way down the rest of the car, again, this is how the tub should look, and it's maybe kind of hard to capture in the video. You should be able to see more yellow, this is a speed yellow car, on the edges, and it gets thinner towards the center. If it's completely shiny yellow, it's been refinished. If it's perfectly body schutz gray, it's been refinished. Again, just think how this was painted. They didn't have these plastic rockers on here. The sort of the fog of paint when they were painting the car new would have just sort of worked its way under the car, and that's why you'll find it thicker, for example, on the ridges than you will on the flat parts. So that's one way to tell originality underneath one of these cars. As I continue to make my way back, a couple things that I'm looking for. Oftentimes they get damaged at the lift points. I'm not really sure why. It's not that hard to put them on a lift, but I've seen all sorts of craziness under here. It's usually an indication of a bad owner. The other thing is I'm looking at the rockers for evidence of use at a track, and I'll make it really clear. I'm a fan of taking your car to the track. They're a Porsche. They're meant to be driven and enjoyed, so this is in no way saying don't track your car, but a lot of people want to know if a car has been tracked. Your best indication is you're going to have all this sort of road wear, rubber, cone marks, if it's autocross. You can definitely spot a car that spent time at the track, generally underneath, and it's just something good to know. But again, please go use your car as intended. Let's work our way farther back. Again, I have removed, there's two covers. There's a cover which plugs in and covers the transmission area here, as well as there's a separate cover for the engine compartment. While we're staring at the transmission, let's have a little conversation about transmissions. This car features a transmission called the G5020. You can actually find the transmission type and number here. So you can see the G5020. And I'll go on record, and I told you when I started the video, I'm not necessarily always a 993 fanboy. This transmission is the single biggest handicap in the car. I think it's poorly geared. In the US, they geared it very, very tall for fuel economy reasons. It's just simply too tall. For example, I don't think you hit 3,000 RPM until you're about 83 or 84 miles an hour, 6th gear, and these cars don't like to lug, so keep the revs up on them. I find 6th gear to not be very useful, and 2nd gear is a big hole. You know, you come out of 1st, you hit 2nd, it's a big hole. In Europe, they got a transmission called the G5021. It's markedly better. Same 1st gear, a shorter 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. However, I do wish it was even shorter than that. Probably the best upgrade you can make on a 993 is a re-gear, although it is catastrophically expensive, so it is what it is. You can kind of see the various nooks and crannies on the car here. You can really see the all-new suspension that Porsche went to on these cars. So you've got an aluminum frame here that comes up over the top and a multi-link rear suspension. The biggest difference on these things is they just, from a handling perspective, they're so linear and they're so predictable, much more akin to a modern 911 as opposed to an air-cooled 911. If there's any drawback to that is it handles more like a modern 911. So if you want to drive a 993 sideways, you want to be a little bit of a hooligan, if you will, which occasionally I'll admit to wanting to do. I find the 993 not as playful, but easier at the limit, particularly for less experienced drivers, and it's very predictable. And then the other thing that's nice is you do get quite a bit of benefit. You can see, for example, how it's isolated up here. It sits on these rubber mounts, which isolate all kind of the crashing and the rumbling and the vibration from the rear suspension that you tend to get on earlier 911s out on a 993. So a pretty cool, innovative feature. So drive perspective wise, a 993 is definitely the most modern driving of the air-cooled 911s. A couple other things I'm going to do when the car's up on the lift. This is a good place for sometimes to inspect the wheels. So we talked about hollow spoke versus solid. So you can see this style spoke. This tells you this is a solid spoke wheel. If this were hollow, this would be smooth back here. Okay, that's one of the spots. One other weak point on 993s is suspension. This car is a factory MO30 car, but here in the US, if you got MO30, you still got the lousy US ride height springs, although you got better sway bars and a little better spring rate with the factory MO30. So one of the things on my to-do list is I'm actually going to change probably to the Porsche Classic Bilstein dampers and switch to the rest of world MO30 springs. That brings up my next thing, which is ride height. A lot of people get really spun up about ride height, and they have no idea really what they're talking about. And they say, oh, the US ride height, it's so terrible. Well, the factory specification difference is 10 millimeters higher in the rear, so less than a ½ inch. And the front difference is more pronounced, it's 20 millimeters. And the measurement is not taken at the fender lip. The factory specification is taken from this location here in the back. So you measure this when the car on the ground, from here to the ground would be this factory specification, and at the front, it's measured from here downward. That would be specification for ride height. So most people, when they say they want rest of world ride height, really want more like RS ride height. The standard rest of world ride height, again, 20 millimeters lower in the front, 10 millimeters lower in the rear. So it's not the game changer. People act like it's inches. It's not, it's millimeters. With that said, I do not like how this car sits. One other interesting kind of funny thing you'll notice too, the factory was so particular. If you look at these cars, they actually used a spacer because they knew the spring variance was slightly different. So there was 3 different factory spacers you could get. They're anywhere from a 3, a 5, or an 8 millimeter spacer just to level the car out side to side with manufacturing differences. So when you get these cars, sometimes you'll find you have a spacer and sometimes you don't. And they have, if you look in the factory service manual, they'll have a code, I think, which one means what in terms of color code. But yeah, it's kind of funny. So I've disassembled these and gone, why do I have spacer on one side and not the other? Well, the factory measured it, and just due to tolerances, maybe it was 3 millimeters off left and right, so they put a little spacer in there. Kind of a fun little thing. Okay, so now we're underneath the engine, the magical flat 6. Great motor. Again, typically you would have an engine cover. I've removed this so we can look and see what we've got here. So a lot of people denigrate 964s and say 964s are leakers. I'm here to tell you folks, 993s can be leakers every bit as much. They use the same exact case, the same architecture, so they're going to have the same common leak issues. Really the only difference is they came factory with head gaskets as opposed to early 964s didn't, but they are now prone to leaks. Our newest 993, when we think about this, is 25 years old. They're not new cars. A lot of people think that all air-cooled 911s leak oil. What I would say to that is most of them leak oil, but that is not the standard. The standard is they do not leak oil. So let's talk about places where they most commonly leak. So most common leaks on 993s I find are timing chain covers left and right. So this would be here. You'll generally find leaks in this area. This is very common. You'll typically see it along here on the passenger side. Very common. If we move over to the cam towers and the valve cover gaskets, they'll typically be wet here. Again, this car is dry, but as a relative reference, I probably inspect 5 or 6 993s a month, and I might run into 2 in an entire year that are completely dry. I mean, it's pretty unusual. They also like to leak, cylinder head base gaskets, even though they have head gaskets like a 964, unlike early 964, they do like to leak. So if you're seeing any kind of leaks in the case, that's problematic. Oil return tubes can leak, not as common as on the earlier cars. You can see these are the original ones to this particular car. What I really don't want to see is I don't want to see evidence of case or through bolt leaks. So I want to make sure my center of my case is dry. This can sometimes be hard because sometimes I'll have a leak that's blowing back. So sometimes, particularly if it's your own car, clean the leaks up, go drive and use it, and then start monitoring and start figuring out where those leaks are at. So those are going to be your most common leaks. They also will leak from the power steering pump drive up above. Sometimes too, if you've recently changed the oil, your one oil filter sits here, and sometimes there'll be oil, and sometimes it's hard to tell, was that just from a sloppy change, or is that, you know, a leak coming from the top side of the car. So those are your common spots. Transmissions tend to not be leaky in this generation, but they should be dry as well. I'm always going to be looking at CV boots. That's just a wear item, so inspect those both inside and out. So you can kind of look there. There's our lousy Bose shocks that Porsche used on these cars. If there's two weak points in these cars, transmission gearing and factory suspension tuning, at least in terms of shock, is not my favorite thing about the car. You can see, though, for example, on the 993, the completely different style exhaust system from a 964. So your heat exchangers come back into sort of a crossover pipe, and then it's got two cats and mufflers coming out the back. One difference between the 95 cars and the later OBD2 cars is actually, while they look similar, they no longer cross over. So in the 96 cars, it comes out and splits out the other side, but the gases don't mix on those later style exhausts. A couple other things. I like to look at the back side of bumper covers for evidence of damage, because again, usually they'll have an impact and people will repair what you see, but they won't necessarily repair what they can't see. So I want to be making sure all my heat shielding and everything is intact. That's usually a good indication. The bumper cover looks nice, but then all of a sudden I see evidence of overspray and these are all been banged out or are missing. That's usually a bad sign. Okay, once we were kind of step back just a little bit too, it's really useful when a car's on a lift. It gives you kind of a different angle to look at a car. So I encourage you to kind of look at the back. The exhaust tips oftentimes get ground underneath where maybe they've run aground. This will be damaged underneath, very, very common. You know, fasteners broken off on the plastic bumper covers, things like that. Again, we're inspecting, you know, tire wear, almost always wear to the inside on these cars. Looking at from this angle, we're going to be checking brakes. We can get a pretty good visual indication of where brake pad life is at on these cars by probably hard to capture on the video, but looking in here, you'll get a good visual on your brake pads. Also, take a look at your rotors and make sure they're not forming a lip or they're not cracking near the vent holes for the ventilated brakes here. From a wheel perspective, the only thing else to note is make sure you have your wheel lock key. Very commonly goes missing, so when I'm inspecting a car, I want to make sure I have it, because I can't tell you how many times I've gotten to an important point of a repair and I can't get the wheel off, and it drives me crazy. My video guy can get in the fender well there. The fender wells on these cars should look very similar to like we talked about in the trunk. It should be a fog of color. It should not be a perfect, you know, it should not be speed yellow with the perfect sheen at the top of the car. They just fog that color in. One nice improvement they did make on 993s is they do have full fender liners, which are really, really nice. One, they keep things cleaner, but they protect the car. For example, on my early 911, I was driving the other day and I had a rock come up and actually dent the inside of my fender. So I have a dent coming up because a rock got stuck in the sticky rubber. And so you won't have that effect on 993s. Looking down the rockers, you'll find that these are texturized, again with the body shuts. So if they're not texturized, you know something's happened to them. And so it's a good opportunity to be kind of looking down the car. This is where I start looking for things like original paint. You'll notice original paint has kind of a nice soft orange peel effect to it. If you look at it, it's maybe hard to capture in the video, but it's got sort of a texture to it. That's one of the good indications of original paint. And sometimes it's easier to spot paint work, frankly, when you're looking up, because most painters, obviously they're painting from up here, and so it tends to get more fogged down lower, and you'll see evidence of that. Very similar things at the front. Brake calipers, the clear likes to wear off. People use, you know, things like a wheel acid because they're too lazy to actually clean the wheel. It's a good idea to check that out. I also always want to give the wheels a good spin to make sure the brakes aren't dragging, particularly on low mileage cars. You know, sometimes you'll get brake drag, which will exhibit as weird steering or handling feel. The other thing you can do on the rear, you can check for a limited slip by basically, if you want to know, does the car have a limited slip? This car does. So if you have a limited slip car, if you spin the wheel, the other wheel will spin the same direction. If you have a non-limited slip car, it'll spin the opposite direction. So that's kind of your indication whether you have a limited slip or not. Again, let me show you the covers. I'm a big fan of these. Again, I know it's controversial and not everyone. This is the engine cover. One of the reasons I like this cover, one, if you have a typical 993 and you have leaks, it'll keep your friends and neighbors happy you're not leaking on their driveway, but it's a really good diagnostic tool. So if you go inspect the 993, pull the engine cover off, and if it's leaking, you'll generally find it in one of the corners. And always be suspicious. Frankly, if I pulled an engine cover off on most 993s and it looked this clean, I would assume someone cleaned it to hide something. This is just my neurotic self, but it's a really good diagnostic tool. So that's the engine cover, very, very similar. This would be the cover of the transmission, same thing. You know, when this is on the car, it should capture if we've got a leak, as well as this is the one over the front steering. So if you have a leak at the steering rack, you're going to have some power steering fluid here. So that's sort of a good indication. So one of the reasons I like to remove them is they help me do my job. I can see if the car's got any leaks. So there's just some basic things underneath the car. Again, I always, and I've said it multiple times, encourage you, if you're going to buy a 993 or any Porsche, do invoke the services of a well-regarded and smart, independent Porsche shop to look the car over. So you've made it this far in my 993 video and you think, this guy's crazy, he's insane, where does he get this information? If you want to know, I'm a big believer in source material. While I certainly love the various forums and groups, I appreciate them, I like to have actual documentable resources where this information comes from. And Porsche, one of the things I love about the Germans, they do a great job of documenting what they're doing. And so I've been collecting literature for many years. So let's talk about what information is out there and where you might go to glean some information. So with that, a couple things that I love, kind of the one thing I love most, my favorite thing of all things, is Porsche printed these service information books. These books are so fabulous because they have answers to all these things people think we don't have answers for. So I just put some fun stuff. For example, this one talked about the various spacers. So look, if you want to know what the rear suspension we talked about, there's an 8mm, it has 2 lines. 2 lines is, or actually, 1 line is 8, 2 lines is 5, 3 lines is 3. This is just kind of really interesting, good information if you have one of these cars. I noted, we talked about the various brake systems. Actually, no, I noted, let's see what oh, here we go. So people want to say, oh, that's not true about ride height. Well, here's the answer. So here we go. This is in the front. U.S. ride height, 174 millimeters, plus or minus 10. Rest of world, 154. And then the rear, rest of world, 147. USA, 157. And again, like we referenced in the video earlier, here are the measuring points. It's not measured at the fender lip, but measured here. So great information you can glean in things like this. So here's, for example, with the introduction of the car. Here's one that goes through, for example, the introduction of the Carrera 4 as well as the Targa. So let's just see what I noted here. I just put little flags on stuff. Oh, you know, curb weight. So when people want to say, what's the difference in weight between a regular Carrera 4 and a 4S? Well, it's kind of interesting. 3175 for a narrow body, 3197 for a wide body. So at least according to the factory, the wide body adds 22 pounds of weight. Pretty nominal, right? So they also have these things, there's sales training back in period. So if you were working for Porsche, how would you learn about the new product? These are great resources. A couple other things I like. Adrian Streether, give him a call out. He published a book called The Essential Companion. It's quite good. We've later learned there are a few things that we've learned that aren't 100% correct in the book, but he did a knock-up job. I think it's a very impressive resource. Everyone should have one of these on their bookshelf. We got, of course, our period reviews, you know, of the car, you know, Auto Week from back in late 93. Of course, the Riviera Blue that was featured in Road and Track back in January of 94, which really stoked the passion for this car for many of us. Even the little video Porsche put out back in the period. These are VHS. I need to dig out a VHS player so we can watch those. I'm also a big fan of getting the old technical bulletins that Porsche used to fax out to their dealers. So for example, here's a fax talking about the introduction of the new sport seat. So you say, well, how did Nathan know that in June of 94 they phased those seats out? Well, it's dated June 24th, 1994. This is when Porsche went to the new hardback style from the previous I'm also a big fan of things like order guides. So this would have been an order guide from 1996, and it would tell you all the different interior codes, option costs, what the various Z codes would have meant. Very, very useful tool. I think I actually uploaded a few of these to Renlist. You can find those there. As well as Porsche had a book each year called the Fact Book. It's kind of useful. This was sent out to salespeople and whatever, and it would have a price guide, and it would have all the key facts and figures. Kind of a nice pocket guide. These are nice. These are the product information that was sent to the press for any given year. So they'll have all the technical drawings, press release, pricing information, and kind of their core brand statements. Kind of useful. And then I love brochures. Gotta love brochures. They made a bunch of brochures for the 993. You can see them change over time. These are the earliest ones, kind of cycling through time. You can generally find these brochures in places like eBay. Kind of fun to have. And then you get ones like the color brochure. So if you want to know what colors were available, you have that, access to that, as well as interiors. Then I sit there and dream about all the colors we should have ordered. Why did not enough people order chestnut brown or Provence blue? Ooh, that's so good. Yeah, flamenco red. Some great colors in there. So that's kind of fun, as well as things like the exclusive catalog. This will actually feature some of the things shown on that 993 C4S we have in the background with the Boxster red interior. So you can see, for example, the cell phone console with the burl wood for the doors, the painted wheels. XD9 is the option code for that. So just definitely nice to have source material. And then last but not least, we got to talk about our specific car. So what should your car have come with? We already covered what was coming in the trunk, but we'll cover a couple things like owner's manual, books, keys, things like that. So in terms of keys, the early cars do not have an immobilizer or a remote. They simply have just a key. Starting in middle model year 1995, they did get the immobilizer, and it came in a big fat, what we call the switchblade. I forgot to bring it in for this photo. It's a horrible piece of equipment. There's another thing about 993s I don't like. I do like this later style fob. It works quite well. The immobilizer is another drawback to the 993. Do make sure you have a spare remote, as well as you keep a spare battery in the glove box, along with the required DME relay. So those are what your keys are going to look like, as well as a little leather key bag they would have come with. If you came with a factory radio, it would have come with a case for the face. So in my case, it was the Alpine, so I got this. If you have a Becker, it would have come with a little Becker case. This would be what the leather folio would be for the owner's manual. And again, please read your owner's manual. You'll actually learn things like how to check your oil. It's right in there. Cars also came with a maintenance book. Your maintenance books should have its original date of in-service. So in my car's case, 8/6 of 95 at our local Porsche store. And then it should have a nearly identical sticker to what's under the hood, color code, interior codes, option code, and VIN on there as well. In an ideal world, it would be stamped. I don't believe mine is stamped. Sadly, our local dealer didn't do that, so they did the pre-delivery and nothing else. But my German friends, they always stamp their books. Thank you so much, my German friends. You'll get a dealer directory. You'll generally get a guide on high-performance tires. In terms of radios, in 1995, there were two possible radios. This was the standard option. It was called the Porsche CR1, made by Alpine. That's a cassette, and you could add a CD changer as an option. If you just wanted an in-dash CD, again, you got the Alpine 7807. Later on, Porsche switched to Becker. And then last but not least, I'm a big fan of having documentation for cars. So this is my car. I've got all the brochures here. I've got the original window sticker. I'm a big fan, so I know exactly how the car came. I've got its original order. It was a special ordered car. That's how we got things like full leather and no sunroof. All its original delivery paperwork. You know, that's the kind of documentation that I want to see. And then I have all the service history, you know, from early on all the way through current. And why do I care so much about service history? Well, one thing we didn't touch on is on the 993, one of the other known issues is odometer failure. So let's just dive into this because this is a controversial topic, and I'm going to go on record, I'm going to say this. The vast majority of the 993s that are on the market, I have some suspicion about the mileage potentially not being accurate. And not because there's a big nefarious ring of people rolling back odometers on 993s, but simply the fact that they're 25 to 30-year-old cars. The odometers commonly break. They've been through multiple hands, and so sometimes we don't have good record as to what those are. So be suspicious unless you can prove otherwise. So why do I say that? So for example, my car, it's got 11,000 miles. I can clearly look at the car and all the indications are that's right, and it also lines up with all the service history, and I bought it from its original owner. I feel very comfortable. If I end up with a car that's got 100,000 miles on the odometer and it's had 9 owners in 4 states, and I have no documentation, and the car looks pretty tired and pretty worn, it could be 100 or it could be 250. I don't really know. So don't pay a premium for a 993 for mileage unless you can prove otherwise. With that said, I'm not a person who only thinks you should buy a low mileage. I happen to have a low mileage car because I like its quality, but I do think you should drive and enjoy it. I used to have a 993 with 170,000 miles on it. Fabulous car. I drove it everywhere. Drive and enjoy your car. And the problems you'll have with a 993 are not necessarily just related to mileage. They're related to time. So for example, I would anticipate having similar problems with my car because it's now 30 years old as I would one even if it had 80 or 90,000 miles on it. In fact, I might just have different types of issues for lack of use. So there's no panacea whether you go low mileage or high mileage. Just simply buy the best car you can find with the best history and documentation, and you know who's had it, where it's been worked on, what's happened to it, and that somebody has loved it. That's going to be your best buy in the 993 world. I oftentimes get accused of being a purist who only wants all original cars. So I'm going to mix it up and I'm actually show you a car that I built many years ago that's heavily modified. In fact, I'm going to call this car the Renlist Top 20. I sold this car several years ago to a very good friend of mine, so thank you, Michael, for bringing the car today so I could feature it. But I started working on this car, I think sometime in the mid-2000s. I was heavily into Renlist at that time, and I was really into, I got to try all the various mods and see what I think. And so I tell you this because I want to talk through some of the mods that are on this car, some of the ones that I really like, some of them that I later regretted, as well as really emphasize the fact you should make the car your own. There's lots of room for improvement, both aesthetically, mechanically, and driving quality on these cars. And so let's just jump right into it, and let's talk about what we did, what I like, what I might do differently in 2023. So first thing you'll probably notice, it's a narrow body car, but it has a either a 2S, 4S, or a turbo bumper cover. I did that because I very much prefer that aesthetic over the regular narrow body bumper cover, and that's a win. I would do that again. You'll also notice it has the Turbo S style brake ducts on the front. I still like that look, although probably if I did this again, I would probably do a Euro front bumper cover with no bumperettes and probably not do the ducts, but that's just sort of a change over time. So kind of fun. If we walk around up to the front here, I did swap the brakes for big reds. I had them, the parts were not that expensive at that time, and it just seemed like the sexy thing to do. And what I will say is it looks great, I love it, but ultimately did it make that big a difference? No. But I guess I had bragging rights, so I would score that. I might not do that again, but it was fun to do. I'm glad I did it. This car is wearing a set of Carrera 3 wheels. Michael swapped those out not too long ago. I've probably had 5 or 6 different sets of wheels on this car. Wheels are fun. They're like jewelry. You just swap them and change them as your mood desires. My only thing I say about wheels is make sure you get the right fitment and make sure you use a good quality wheel, whether it's an OEM Porsche wheel or from a good company like a BBS, you know, Fixie, someone that's a higher end, high quality wheel. I'm a big fan of. You'll probably notice the ride height on this car is a little bit lower. This car, we did use the Bilstein PSS 10 coilovers. I think that was a good choice, gives you ride height adjustability, and the ride quality is pretty close to factory. We did swap to the Euro turbo sways, front and rear. That was actually a really good move. I actually would probably do that before I did the PSS 10s in terms of handling dynamic. I thought that was a big, big improvement. Going around to the back, my favorite thing I did on this car, we put on the 2S split rear grille. You could accuse me of heresy. It doesn't belong on a narrow body car, but man, I like it, and I figured let's do it. I just thought it looked great in body color. We did do the factory to equipment wide oval exhaust tips. I think that's the best looking exhaust tip on that car. Love it. On a very related note, a big shout out to our man Darren Pfister, developed the Pfister exhaust. This car does have Pfister Stage 3 exhaust on it, which if you're not familiar with that, basically what Darren does, he takes the factory exhaust or mufflers, you send them to him, he cuts them open, works some magic, puts them back together. They look factory when you get them back, and they fit like factory because they are factory, but they sound so good, yet they don't have any drone, which sometimes is the problem with aftermarket exhaust. You know, you get the classic 2,800 RPM drone. The Pfisters are great. This is a Stage 3. I love them, except if you're going to get up before about 6 a.m. My wife doesn't like it when I start them up. But otherwise, absolute win. On the inside, we've done quite a few other things too. You'll note we swapped the sport seats from a 996. Back then, you could buy 996 sport seats for about a third of the cost, and they were more available than the 993, and they fit in there well. So that was kind of a fun change. Not technically correct, but kind of a fun change. We did go to the red seat belts, as well as we did the equipment. You'll see the carbon and leather 3-spoke 996 steering wheel, as well as the very hard to find now equipment carbon shift and brake knob. If Michael wasn't such a good friend, I would probably steal them from him because these are unobtainium right now. And I pulled those out of my several-year-old parts stash when I put those in probably a dozen or so years ago. So kind of a neat change. The other changes that I made that I probably wouldn't do again, I did change out, for example, the head unit. I think I did the later 996 style head unit. I'm more of a fan now of either the Porsche Classic radio or the Blaupunkt Bremen. The Continental's not a bad choice either. It looks sort of period, but that's an easy change out. Let's show a few more things. Let's look in a few compartments and I'll show you. Again, it was just a lot of fun to touch and play and do a bunch of different things. We did put the factory motor sound airbox on the car. That was simple. Again, with between that and the Pfister Stage 3s, it sounds brilliant. I updated the motor mounts to the more RS style motor mounts. Didn't make as big a difference as I thought. Everyone talked about it. Did put in the RS lightweight clutch and flywheel. There's a little bit of pros and cons to that. The car does spin up appreciably better. That's noticeable. If you're going to drive the car in stop and go traffic, I find it's a little bit more particular. You got to pay a little more attention. Like for example, if, heaven forbid you're doing something bad, like talking on the phone, of course using Bluetooth. You got to have your mind on it. It's a little trickier. So I'm kind of 50-50, depends on use case, whether I would do the RS clutch and flywheel again. A few other things. We did do the FD Motorsports goldenrod and short shifter on this car. I love the Stage 3 mufflers. I'm more mixed on the goldenrod, just being honest. I think it helped, but it wasn't the game changer a lot of people purport it to be. It was a 5 or 10% improvement, not the 100% sometimes I heard online. So it's fun to do this stuff. Let's jump around to the front and see what else I changed in the Frunk. I can't really remember at this point, so we'll get a surprise when we open this. Oh yeah, we did do the, I don't even know if anyone makes these anymore. I think these were made by Das Shield, a little shield liner. Kind of nice if you're actually going to drive the car, protect the hood from getting, you have something too tall, you dent through the hood, kind of useful. I think we did do a strut tie bar on this car. Let me check. We did, but see, this is the way I like to do it. See the strut tie bar here? Frankly, I don't know that it makes any difference, but what was nice is I learned that you can actually keep it tucked behind the carpet. So many other people cut the trunk carpet for it. I guess if that's your style, I like that it looks a little bit more discreet. One other change we did at the front of the car is we did do electronics on this car. I guess we did the box. I guess we did not do factory electronics. It must have been another car I had. But I did swap these to sort of an aftermarket lighting kit, which I may have pulled out One thing I will say about 993's factory headlights are not great. And I don't care what anybody tells you, when you do the new updated kit, they don't work better because the problem is in the reflector design. It's not in the bulb or the fact that it's xenon or LED. It's the reflector design. It's not great or modern. So there isn't a great way to get modern quality lighting in a 993, or at least that I've run across. So I wanted to walk you through this car because, one, I love this car, but two, I wanted to show you all the possibilities you could have with a 993. You can touch almost everything on this car. You can modify, you can change it, you can dial it in, you can leave it bone stock. I'm good with all of it as long as you're having fun and you're enjoying it. You've made it this far. Obviously, you must really, really enjoy the 993 like I do. I really hope you enjoyed this information. I really hope you learned something. Most importantly, what I hope is that you have the opportunity to own, drive, and love this amazing piece of Porsche history.